we'll just get started. So I'd like to introduce Courtney Bailey, who comes to us from Voconiq, the project lead, which is the fabulous professionals in this space, and she will lead us through the results. And she's actually also, we saw her yesterday with the animal industries. She focuses down on your particular industry, so it's super interesting and super exciting. Over to you, Courtney.
Thanks so much, Emma, and great to be here and see everyone on the call today. So as alluded to by Emma, what we're doing today is looking specifically at the Community Trust in Levied Industries project, but we're going to focus in on plant industries today. Yesterday we did the animal industries. But first what we'll do is give you a little bit of an introduction to Voconiq and who we are. So I'm Courtney Bailey. I'm the agriculture sector lead at Voconiq. We're an engagement science company, and what we really do focus on is primary research on the relationship between communities and organisations that impact them. What that looks like in the ag sector is often broad scale, nationally representative surveys of the Australian or international community and a particular industry of choice. We have a number of different projects outside of agriculture as well in energy, mining, transmission and infrastructure, to name a few. So we conduct that primary research. We also do smaller pieces of work in both qualitative and quantitative fields to really understand what communities are saying and help those industries listen to them. We also do extension work, so getting that research and putting it out into the field, which is often a big problem in the agriculture space. And then finally, we conduct learning and development to help people that gather this data and have access to it actually use it and make a strategic difference within their organisation, business or community. So that's us in a nutshell. In terms of this piece of work, it's kind of one of a wider gamut of projects that we're working on with AgriFutures Australia and some of our other project partners, which I can see a few on the line today. Great to see you guys. So the first is the Community Trust in Rural Industries piece, and that's what's being launched tomorrow. Thanks for the shout out, Emma, really appreciate it. That one is a nationally representative study of Australian rural industries in general. That we're in our 6th year of study for that, and we found some really good pivotal findings that we'll go into that has helped us to inform our particular study for Levied. The next piece is our Community Perceptions and Worker Experience project, and that's looking at attraction and retention in the Australian agriculture industry and what's actually driving people to consider coming over to a career in agriculture. And then finally, this piece of research, Community Trust in Levied Industries. So we've taken our knowledge from 6 years and over 25,000 data points in CTRI, and we've refined that research down into a really, I guess, basic tool, but actually complex, that's looking at measuring both trust and acceptance in your levied industries. And then we can break it down by specific industry type. And what we're looking at when we do these nationally representative surveys is kind of doing 3 things at once. And first is prescribing a number to what people think and feel. So we're collecting quantitative data. The next piece is we're collecting qualitative data through comment banks and open text fields and trying to dig deeper into what people are actually thinking. And then finally, we collect that longitudinally, so across time. And so combining these 3 types of data sets and methodologies, we're actually able to not only understand whether or not people trust you, but put a little bit of color and understand why, and also use that to determine where our risks are as an industry and also our opportunities. So we've got a really good tool in our trust model to help you determine what to action next as an industry. So hopefully you find that, oh, hi everyone, that's really good to see your introductions. Hopefully you find this helpful. What we're going to do first is just dive into those CTRI findings as a bit of a sneak peek for what you might actually see from our press releases tomorrow. So this nationally representative survey has found kind of 4 key things that are relevant to you as a levied industry body. The first is that trust remains stable over time and acceptance is growing. So in Voconiq, we talk about trust and acceptance. Trust is kind of the quality of the relationship between you and your community. So whether those warm, fuzzy relational feelings are there and what you can do to change it. The second is acceptance, and that we use as our proxy measure for social license to operate. And that's kind of the harder edge of the industry, whether or not the community is going to be welcoming you with open arms and giving you benefit of the doubt when things go wrong. So two pivotal measures there. The second thing we found from CTRI over the past 6 years is environmental concerns are significant, and they continue to be increasingly significant. What we found, and I'll go through this a few times in our levied work, is that not only are environmental concerns important, but the general public or the community has a real focus on sustainability issues in levied and actually see technology and sustainability playing a good role in the future of these industries. The next piece, and it comes out strong in our levied work as well, is that rural identity and feeling connected to the land are really important when understanding what's happening in community perceptions work, and also that these two things help you handshake in terms of acceptance and build that relationship really strongly with your community. And then finally, probably important for us to think about while we're in the room today is perceptions of information is influenced strongly by the number of people known in the industry. So in this research, we split by demographic. And one of the demographic questions we ask is how many people do you know in the agriculture industry? What we found is that pretty much every time, the more people you know, the more different your perceptions are than the rest of the general community. Why that's important to us in this room is we know a lot of people in agriculture, so our perceptions are going to be radically different to those that don't know anyone or know very few people in the industry. So it's really important for us to credit that and understand that we sit in an echo chamber today, and this data helps us step outside of that and look with a different perspective. So what is the Community Trust in Levied Industries piece of work? So as Emma said, this is the first of a 3-year program of study where we are going to seek to understand community trust and acceptance specifically in the levied industries field. So we have asked about 15 different levied and emerging industries in this survey, and we have everything from ratings on trust and acceptance all the way through to knowledge, and then some specific questions regarding industry issues, which we'll touch on a few of those today. This will also lead to training and support to help you and your industry monitor and adapt to changes in perception over time. So we'll get this same size data set over 3 years. And at the end of this duration, we'll have around 9,000 responses from the Australian community and be able to track what's going on and identify the risks relevant to you. This year is specifically focused on baseline scores. So we were trying to really understand, one, in what way do levied industries as a group differ from rural industries in general? And two, what are the specific issues that are pertinent to each individual levied industry, and how can we ensure that levied groups are working together to get the most out of this investment? So coming up for each levied group through the LEI team in AgriFutures will be some training in this dashboard, this data dashboard that we'll dive into shortly, but also some ongoing support from Voconiq to ensure you understand the strategic implementations of this data. Just at a high level though, how did we collect this data and who did we ask? So as I said, we collected just under 3,000 samples from the Australian community, a nationally representative survey across all states of Australia, a very reasonable gender split, and we also looked to other demographic factors like education, age, region, and as I mentioned before, how many people do you know work in Australian agriculture industries? So we had quotas for all of these different demographic factors and then went out and collected a nationally representative sample. We originally had around 3,300 people participate, and then we do data cleaning and analysis to make sure what we're getting is actually quality information via our panel to give you your final results. All right, before we dive into trust and acceptance levels, has anyone got any questions before we work through that? Looks good. If you do have questions as we go along, you're welcome to stick your hand up or also put questions in the chat. I'll get to them when I can. If we don't get time to answer all questions today, or if I don't know the answer, we'll definitely follow up with you after this webinar. Okay, so now let's look at trust and acceptance. Headline, trust and acceptance in Levied Industries is good. It's actually very good. So as I said earlier, we measure two things: trust, the warm fuzzy relational measure of you and the community, and then acceptance, which is our proxy for social license to operate. What I've got here is on the screen our levied results, and then underneath our CTRI results. So we can do a direct comparison between levied and general agriculture or rural industries as a whole. What we found this year is that your trust was 3.34 out of 5. So you'll see a lot of things today in our Voconiq data. We generally score things out of 5. This particular scale is not at all through to very much. So do you trust the Australian agriculture industry? Do you trust rural industries? And in this case, do you trust Australian levied industries? And out of 5, the community scored you 3.34. What that means is that more of the community trust you than do not trust you. We'll go through each individual industry's trust score later on in this presentation, but compared to CTRI or rural industries overall, you can see that score for CTRI is 3.38. So very similar scores, both quite positive, and it looks good for the Australian community and the relationship between them and levied. Next is our acceptance score, and funnily enough, you actually scored higher than CTRI. So again, this is scored on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 not being not at all and 5 being very much. And you can see here that the acceptance between the Australian community and levied industries is strong. And that allows you to think about the fact that not only is your relationship very strong, but the community is going to give you benefit of the doubt. So if something goes wrong, if there's a news article that's released where there's a water issue or some pesticide leakage, the community isn't going to throw their hands up in disgust straight away. They're actually willing to have an open conversation with the levied group, and they're actually willing to experiment with you on different methods. So that's a really good score and a great way to start from our baseline for this research. The next piece is our recipes for social license, or our trust model. So I'm going to unpack this because at first glance it looks a little bit complicated. So let's work through it today. So on your left-hand side, you'll have what we call our drivers of trust. So these are grouped questions that we've then assigned a theme to, and we'll go into those in a minute. You can see I've actually ranked them from most important at 1 to still important, but probably least important out of the 4 at 4. You'll also see different coloured lines. So the blue lines represent a positive relationship. So what we've got here is procedural fairness. The more the community feels that levied industries are working in a procedurally fair way, the more they will trust you. We also have red lines, which indicate a negative relationship. So here, the more the Australian community feels that increased regulation is necessary in these levied groups, and I change the wording a little bit later in the presentation to make it seem a little bit more sensible, but the more the community feels that you need to regulate harder, the less they trust you. So that's an opposite relationship. The next thing you'll notice are these lines sometimes go directly to just trust, or directly to just acceptance, or they might go to both. So sometimes something that impacts trust will also impact acceptance in different levels. You'll also see here trust is a driver of acceptance. So that's an important relationship we like to talk about. So trust does also lead to acceptance, and any change in trust will also change the acceptance, or the Australian community's acceptance of you. Next, you'll see some numbers here. I generally say just ignore these numbers. So these are just weightings based on the analysis in this particular environment. Why they're important basically is the larger one means more important. So I've just said ignore that and have a look at the numbers I have here on the far left. Okay. What they are important to know, though, is that this one here at 0.34 is over doubly as important as this one here at 0.15, support for the use of chemicals. So what that means is the amount of work put in to change this rural industries is responsible is at doubly as effective as the support for the use of chemicals driver. Important to note. I'm going to quickly go through these drivers, and then we're going to have a look at what questions sit underneath these in the survey. So the first one is procedural fairness. So whether or not you have things in place that allow the Australian community to think that your systems and processes are fair. The next one is support for use of chemicals. So whether or not they support the industries actually using chemicals, and whether or not the Australian community can toss up the positives and negatives of using chemicals. And there's a lot of interesting questions that have come out of here that I think from a plant industry perspective are really, really important for us to consider. The next one is responsibility. So whether or not we are using our technologies in a responsible way and responding to changes in the environment has been considered the #1 driver of trust for levied industries this year. And then finally, regulation. So the way this one is worded is the more that people feel regulation in Australian levied industries needs to improve or increase, the less they trust you. But we look at regulation as all of the things that underpin our systems and processes. And there's some interesting findings that came out of that this year as well. Finally, a direct driver of acceptance is the importance of rural industries to Australia. That's quite a strong driver, and you'll really enjoy the results that came out of that one this year, and I'll showcase those towards the end of the drivers. Okay, so let's go into responsibility. So again, this is our largest driver of trust, and it's what's impacting the trust the most. So if I was thinking from a strategic standpoint of how to work as a levied industry together with other levied industries, I would look to this responsibility driver first. And it's something that we can certainly work together on. So there's 3 questions here, and we'll address those questions in a second. But what I first want to do is explain this scale to you. So we've got drivers and, we've got scales, and again, they're scored 1 to 5. This scale is from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And you'll see on the left-hand side is the aggregated disagrees, so the oranges, and on the right-hand side is the aggregated agrees, which is the blues. What we also score is neutral at 3, and we actually pull that out for these comparisons because it allows you to have a look at what the strong polarized views are of the community and compare them directly against each other. And that's really powerful because, as you can see here, there's way more blue than orange, which means things are good. The other piece is looking at these neutrals tells us a really interesting story. So generally we say sort of 35, 36% is okay, but as soon as we start going higher than that and approaching that 39, 40%, there's something going on in those neutrals that's worth looking at. So in this case, the question is, Australian producers, breeders and growers manage their environmental impacts effectively. When someone answers neutral, it generally means they either don't know, don't care, or don't have enough information to answer the question appropriately. So 39% of the Australian community answering 3 to that is really telling that either there's a piece of the story missing or you've got an entirely disengaged community. So often when those neutrals are at that higher percentage or higher, as we'll see later on in this presentation, it's worth us looking at with a critical eye and starting to split by different demographics. So in the responsibility piece, the first question, generally I feel that Australian producers in rural industries treat animals raised for slaughter with dignity and respect throughout their lives. You can see over 50% of the Australian community is agreeing with that. That's really healthy. The thing I want to point out to us here in a plant industries webinar is that despite the fact that you are not raising animals, animal welfare is in one of your major drivers of trust. So activities that happen in other industries, especially in animal industries, are going to impact what happens between the Australian community and your industry. So it's really important to take a step back and think about how we can work together as industries to ensure that trust is robust and to ensure that we're all complying with our legal, statutory and welfare requirements. The next one we've slightly discussed, but environmental impact. So you can see that again, over 50%, and this is only just a click over 50% here, are agreeing that you're managing your environmental impacts effectively. But we've got quite a high neutral percentage there, so there's something that we could probably do as an industry to have a look at that. Finally, Australian rural industries use water responsibly. Again, just over 50% agree with this, and you've got a fairly high neutral, so people are kind of on the fence in regards to what's happening with water there. Okay. So our next one is procedural fairness, and this is the ability for your industry to listen and respond to community concerns and make that community feel heard. And to do that, you need really sound structures in place to ensure the community has feedback mechanisms. And so that's something for us as an industry to think about. So the first question in this is, rural industries in Australia are prepared to change their practices in response to community concerns. So are you hearing it and then acting on it, or seeing to act on it in some way? And I want to point out that action isn't always doing exactly what the community says. We talk about a feedback loop with community here. Often, if somebody gives you information and asks for something, you don't have to do exactly what they say, but you have to explain to them why you're doing it a different way. And you have to engage with them as much as possible. The second one is, rural industries in Australia listen to and respect community opinions. So is there an open discourse, and does the community feel like they're part of that? Now I've got some M scores here. M stands for mean, and I just wanted to compare these questions with the CTRI results because those questions are worded exactly the same in both surveys. So for CTRI, the mean for the first question of whether or not you're changing practices, the mean for CTRI was 3.56. Again, that's above the midpoint, which means more people agree than disagree. Levied Industries, not as high at 3.39, so some work to do in this neutral space to potentially change the way that we're perceived. In good news though, CTRI for listening to and respecting was 3.48, and Levied was a slight bit higher at 3.5. Now we could interrogate why that is, but I think their scores are pretty similar, so I think this is a solid one that we as rural industries and levied industries feel like we're doing well, but could potentially improve with this 34% neutral. Okay, onto chemical use, and I think probably one of the larger sets of questions that lead into drivers of trust for us as an industry. So all of these questions impact trust. So let's go through them, but I think at a headline level, you can see that some are quite strong compared to others. And we also did a playoff with community, and you can see that in the middle questions, and I'll tell you what I mean in that in a minute. Okay, so the first one, the use of herbicides and pesticides by Australian producers is necessary. 47% of the Australian community agree or strongly agree with that question, which is a healthy percent. But again, we've got that sort of neutral piece here that we could definitely work on as an industry. The second one, less relevant to the majority of you, but I support the use of antibiotics in animals if it keeps the animal healthy. Again, we see animal industries and plant industries actually impacting each other's trust. So again, we see we need to work together on our strategies to ensure we're hitting similar things so that one incident in another industry doesn't actually crumble our own trust scores. Now what we've got is some trade-off questions. So we ask the Australian community, if this, then what? It allows us to really explore complexities, because if you can see the first question, it's pretty much a hard yes or a no. But when we start giving trade-off questions, it allows us to see whether or not the community understands and credits the nuance of what happens in rural industries, and also whether or not, when given the nuance, they're sitting in a positive or a negative space for levied. So the first one is, I support producers using weed control chemicals like glyphosate if it means they can increase how much produce they can export. And so here we've got a pretty big split. We haven't seen a split like that in our data set yet. So the Australian community as a whole is actually really grappling with use of chemicals versus productivity. Now, I think I've got some of my grains people on the line, and you know, we use words like glyphosate here, but often the community actually starts to get a bit confused when you get really specific about brands of particular herbicides and pesticides, and even has difficulty differentiating between herbicides and pesticides as words. Often those scores are pretty similar. So what this is telling us is generally the community is split on whether or not to use chemicals, and they're playing that off against export value. So they're not really sure if that goes onto our plate, we might be a little bit more happy about it, but if we're sending it overseas, we may be less happy about it. Interestingly though, this was one of the questions that had the strongest gender split for our data set. So I split this by male and female, and what you've got here is mean numbers. So that average score out of 5 again. So the male scored 3.09. So more men were happy with supporting weed control chemicals than unhappy. But females were the opposite. They were 2.75. They were below that midpoint of 3, which means that females are more critical of the use of pesticides and weed control chemicals. And that's something to keep an eye on. Next, we asked, I support producers using weed control chemicals like glyphosate if it means that the fresh produce in Australia is available and affordable. And you can see the difference between these two questions. When we ask about export, the community is split, but when you ask about food on your plate, the community is more in support of the use of those products. So think about how we message why we're doing this as an industry. It's really important to consider the end goal. And maybe it's not about increasing Australia's GDP and getting these great export markets together. Maybe it's about making food affordable for mum and dad and putting food on our plates. Next one, I support producers using GM technologies if it means they use less chemicals for food production. So again, we're using one of these trade-offs. And so we're getting the community to kind of rank which issue they find more important. And in this case, the Australian community had a higher percentage of people supporting GM over chemicals, but only in the instance where it reduced chemical use. And finally, I am okay with the use of weed control chemicals to protect soil health if it is a more sustainable way of growing crops. So again, a higher percentage of communities thought, hey, you know what, if I'm trading this off, I actually want to have it all. And so if we can change the messaging around chemical use to ensure that we're looking at that biodiversity angle and improving that soil health and about sustainability, you know, we're using mixed methods productions here, guys. That's a really good way to explain what we're doing and talk about what we're doing with the Australian community. One really pivotal takeaway from me working at Voconiq, I've been here 2 years now, is the fact that the Australian community as a whole is really open to having these conversations, and they know a lot more about the things we're doing than we think they do. And even if they don't, the majority of them are open to learning and open to having that conversation, because food production and fiber production and fuel production all directly impacts their day-to-day lives. And as we'll see in a minute, they see agriculture as a pivotal part of their livelihoods. So it's really important that we think about and give credit to the Australian community in those regards. Okay, so next is a piece on regulation. And I've just highlighted the top 3 because, as you can see, this is those types of questions where we really start to get those neutrals looking quite large and probably start to be a bit alarmed by them. So as I said earlier, neutrals are kind of an indicator that people don't know, don't care, or don't have enough information about what's going on. And 49% of neutrals is quite alarming, to be honest. So that's half of the Australian community on the fence about a particular issue. It's an opportunity because if you don't have an opinion on something, it's pretty easy to change that opinion. But it's a risk because any other player could change that opinion. So a news article about water leakages or pesticide runoff or whatever could actually change that 49% into the disagree or strongly disagree very quickly. So it's an opportunity and a risk for industry. So it's worth paying attention to. The next piece is that we often as an industry say, oh, well, we can't affect regulation, so what's the point of even looking at this driver? And whilst we might not be able to affect regulation, we can operate in the regulatory framework in a different way and talk about that regulatory framework in a different way. So it's really important that we have a look at these questions and think about how we interact with the community, whether it be at the pub, having a conversation about the practices that you use on farm and why you do certain things, or why you keep certain records, or why you use certain types of products but not others. And ensure that you're using positive language rather than negative language, because these conversations amplify throughout the community, and your sentiment or your attitude towards something will also amplify too. So the 3 that we're really looking at here are penalties for misusing natural resources in rural industries are not strong enough. So we've got 43% agreeing with that statement. So that's a risk for us. But we have 44%, so a similar number saying we're not sure. So that's an area we can affect. The second one, I don't think regulation in Australian rural industries is effective. even split, but we've got that huge 49% there. So if I was somebody that had access to this dashboard, and I'll show you what I mean in a minute, I would actually go into that question and I would split it by different demographics, because I want to know what's going on in that question. I want to know what demographics specifically are answering in that neutral area and where our biggest risks are. And then finally, one on water. Australian rural industries use more water than they're entitled to. And look, that's actually looking more on the disagree, which is good because they're saying, no, Australian rural industries are responsible. But again, we've got a huge percentage of neutral there in answer to that question. Finally, I just wanted to end on a really high note. This is our acceptance driver. It's the importance of rural industries here. And basically what this tells me is everybody loves you. So we can see our splits here. We've got orange. The slivers of orange there are so small, I can't even read the numbers on who said disagree or strongly disagree to these questions. And you can see a sea of blue, and you can see pretty small percentage of neutral here, very insignificant percentage. So this includes things like the bolstering of regional communities, the importance of these industries to our way of lives as Australians, the importance of the products that you provide, and even, you know, the credit to things like biosecurity practices and bees, which everyone really loved in this survey as well. So the headline to take away from this, if you take nothing else from it, is that the community is on your side. And not just a little bit of them, not just your rural groups. The entire Australian community agrees that rural industries in Australia and Levied is important. And that's something that we can really hold our hat to and feel proud about. So our work is valued. Okay, so before we go into our drivers of trust by industry, I might just quickly stop and see if there's any questions.
There is one, Courtney, from Jeff in the chat.
Yeah, so Jeff says, was there any correlation between education attainment by gender, age, occupation, also city versus country? Yeah, so Jeff, I wouldn't say that there's correlation specifically, but we can certainly look at those different demographics, and often those demographics change different things in what the community thinks about us. I think when we're looking at that city versus country, and I gave myself a bit of a stitch up yesterday presenting, I think it was the trust drivers, and I said, oh, here's how you use the demographic features, and I split it by city and country. No difference. But certainly what we can do in the dashboard is look at each of our demographics of interest and see whether or not there's an effect. And that effect then helps us identify our areas of risk and also our areas of opportunity. Great question. Any more questions before we keep going? Perfect. All right, so we've seen the trust model. I've now given us the four drivers of trust that feature most in rural industries. Apologies for that spelling error. I changed the slide this morning, obviously before I had a coffee. So our four key drivers, as we've talked about, are the responsibility piece, the support or thoughts around use of chemicals, procedural fairness, so are we listening and responding, and then that regulation piece, so whether or not increased regulation is necessary. What we then did was we asked for specifically rated trust around each of our levied groups and knowledge, and we used that information to start to cluster your own industry's drivers of trust. So we've been able to identify what our drivers of trust are for each industry. I think it's really important to point out that the majority of these drivers, so these four drivers, feature in pretty much every one of your industries. So I've put those in italic with a little star next to them. What we're going to do is go through each of your individual industry. We'll talk about your trust score, we'll talk about your knowledge score, and we'll talk about what other drivers featured for you. So first is our fodder group. So trust was 2.96, so a click under that 3, and knowledge was 1.99. So what we found as we were going through these levied groups was that knowledge was often quite low, especially in things like yesterday, buffalo, deer. There was community members that had never heard of those particular things. Somebody said, I never knew we farmed kangaroos. So our perceived knowledge of these are quite low, and it's important to point out that this knowledge score is perceived knowledge, not actual knowledge. So we've just asked them to basically rate how much they think they know about each industry. We haven't given them a quiz. We don't know if they know about your export percentages or your value of production every year or where you produce. We just said, how much do you think you know about this industry? So these people said basically 2, so not very much. Your drivers, or your top 4 drivers of trust for fodder, are the top 4 drivers of trust in our model. So that starts to relate really well to what we could do as a whole group of Levied industries, right? So if we were doing a strategy to improve our relationship with the community and we used the top 4 drivers on the model, that would be great for fodder because it would also impact your own trust scores. The other 3 that we found important for this particular group were the industry accountability piece, which I would say is pretty closely tied to regulation anyway. And then we start to get some really random things come in. So I think it's perfectly acceptable for horses to be bred for sport. Now, whilst this is not a fodder-related question, it seems to be a question that is directly, for some reason, impacting your industry's trust. So again, I can't really explain why this is, but I think it's important to remember that other people's activities impact us. So as a group, we should be talking, we should be aware of what's going on in other industries and thinking about whether or not that might impact our sphere. And then finally, Australian rural industries are innovative compared to global competitors. So this is the first time in this presentation we've sort of seen that innovation, sustainability piece come up, but it's important to think about that in terms of fodder, and we framed it as fodder and export fodder in the survey. So people are starting to link the fact that global markets are actually important for these particular industries. So I think that's really good news. Next is rice, and trust here is over the midpoint, so 3.07, and knowledge is 3.03. So pretty good news for the rice industry, but if you compare rice to fodder, you know, people can go and physically touch rice at the supermarket, so it would make sense that they're a little bit more familiar and feel comfortable saying they know something about rice. Again, you can see our 4 drivers of trust feature in this particular model, but there's also some other specific questions. So we should not be using water to grow crops like rice in Australia when we could just import it. So I think that mean, sorry, I haven't written it down, but I've written it here. That mean was 2.6. So people were actually disagreeing with this. So people are actually thinking, oh, I wouldn't mind locally produced rice. And if you think about the messaging that occurs in the rice industry, that kind of checks out. The next one is, again, a different industry coming in and affecting our trust scoring. So it is unrealistic to expect beekeepers to care about bee welfare. Random, but again, consider that our industries are impacting each other in interesting and sometimes quite random ways. And then finally, standards developed for rural industries in Australia ensure people in those industries do the right thing. So again, that's kind of a regulation or fairness piece, and it's something for us to consider when we think about the rice supply chain and the players in the rice industry. Are we ensuring that we are clear on the standards and clear in what activities are occurring from a modern slavery, but also from a workforce perspective? Really important to think about that messaging. Next is pasture seeds. So pretty good trust here, 3.22, and knowledge under 3 again at 2.16. Again, if you think about the context of this particular industry, it's not surprising that the Australian community doesn't know that much about you. I think it's important to stress here that if you have one of those industries that doesn't have direct relationships with the community as a whole, you actually have power by working together as a group of industries. So even if you're not community facing, if you're working together as a levy group, at least you're getting some of that exposure through other commodities and groups. Okay, so what we can see here, again, our 4 drivers of trust feature. And then again, we've got one on innovation. So Australian rural industries are innovative compared to global competitors. Again, we're seeing that innovation piece come through. Australian receives a fair share of benefits from rural industries in Australia. So that's a distributional fairness piece. So are we sharing benefits and are we also sharing costs? And so when this is sold, or the community thinks about pasture seeds, they're actually playing off the cost and benefits of production, which is really interesting. And then finally, Australian producers, breeders and growers are responsible stewards of the land and sea. So that's kind of a sustainability and environmental piece. So are we actually doing what we're saying we're doing, and are we protecting the environment towards our goals? All right, tea tree oil. Trust, really good at 3.26, and we'll see all of the trust in context shortly. And our knowledge is still under 3, but it's 2.68. Interesting, that one I thought might have been high with the perceived knowledge because of the cosmetics angle, but it would be interesting for us to dig into that a little bit more. So again, we see our top 4 drivers of trust feature in this, and we see a few other specific questions. And I was a little bit surprised because we had some very specific tea tree questions that actually didn't feature as drivers for this group. So what we've got here is seeking information about rural industries. So whether or not people are looking for information about, let's say, tea tree is actually impacting whether or not they trust them. And that leads into whether or not they're informed. So think about that knowledge score. If you don't know too much and you're not bothering looking for information, you're probably not going to trust the tea tree oil industry that much. The next is Australian rural industries are innovative compared to global competitors. So we see this coming in again and again and again. The global nature of some of our levied commodities is really important to the Australian community, and they're thinking about that in the context of the relationship between you and them. And then finally, food produced in Australia adheres to strict food safety standards. I thought this one was interesting considering what we do with tea tree oil, but I probably wouldn't read too much into this. It's just a food question and a safety standards piece that's coming out, I think, from that regulation driver, and that's why it's there. We did ask, though, two specific tea tree oil questions. The first was, it is just as important to use water in Australia to grow ingredients for cosmetic products as it is to grow food. So that was a trade-off question again, and our mean score was 2.9 for that. So the Australian community was slightly on the end of disagreeing with that. And this is something we need to watch as an industry, because as we go into periods of drought, so this was asked when we weren't in an active drought, but as we go into periods of drought, it's likely those points of view will get more extreme. So that's one to watch. The second one is, it's important to grow ingredients for cosmetic products in Australia. This one was really good news for this industry because the mean was 3.5. So people were pretty heavily in agreement that they like to see products grown in Australia, and given that Australian product labelling, which is something we saw come out of the survey. So a lot of Australian community loved product of Australia labelling, loved to see things grown in Australia, and that's a really good value for us to remember, and remember that the value add is there for the Australian community should we take it up. Okay. The next one is ginger. So our trust was 3.29 and our knowledge was 2.61. Remembering the trend so far, I don't think this is particularly surprising, but it's important to know anyway. And we've got our 4 key drivers of trust again here. What we've also got is the importance of rural industries to Australia. So that was also an acceptance driver, remember? And then also that food safety standards piece again, and whether or not we're using technologies to improve the way we operate. So a technology piece is playing into this particular trust driver. It's less about whether or not the ginger industry is using technology, more about rural industries as a whole, or levied industries as a whole. Okay, so the next 2 were emerging industries, I believe, that we asked about, and we didn't ask trust scores on these, but we just threw them in to give a little bit of a flavour to both the hemp and sesame groups. For both, the knowledge, again, below 3, so 2.35 and 2.25, but we also asked a couple of questions just to gauge what the community was thinking about these different groups. So the first question on hemp was, I can describe the difference between hemp and medicinal cannabis. And I think really interestingly, mean of 3. So people are again very split by that particular question. Would be interesting to dig into the percentages there. The next one is, we should use more environmentally sustainable fibres like hemp, and positively, the mean score of that was 3.8. So a lot of the community are on board with the use of sustainable fibres. But important to note that often when we use the word sustainable in the question, the community piles on and says, yes, yes, yes. So it would be good to dig a little bit deeper into why they're looking at that, and what is the actual value, and how do you package that to ensure that the community feels like it's the environmentally sensible option for them. For sesame, we asked one question: heat and drought tolerant crops like sesame will become more important for Australia's agricultural future. And again, really positive, the mean of 3.8 there. So the community is thinking about the nuance of different futures in our rural industries, but also in their food security. So it's important to see that they're actually on board with trying different things or supporting different industries as we move forward. All right, so I've spoken a lot. I'll just give you a couple of key takeaways before we move into some questions and then dive into our data dashboard. So the first takeaway is that we have a really solid baseline. So for both trust and acceptance, our averages were 3.34 and 3.9. That's a really solid foundation for growth. It's similar but different to the community trust work. And it's important for us to use this as a springboard to measure any additional activities we do moving forward. The next piece is that we've got 4, or actually 3 I've put in here because 3 impactful trust drivers. So the responsibility piece, and that's really about welfare, sustainability and water. The procedural fairness piece, which is listening and responding, and the regulation piece. So whether or not we're confident as a community that Levied Industries are following the regulatory guidelines, these all shape community trust. The other piece is that we really value Australian products as a community. So as I said before, labelling, product of Australia, labelling grown in Australia is really important, and it plays into that acceptance piece. We actually had 81% of the Australian community agree or strongly agree that they preferred Australian made products, and 82% saying that they agreed or strongly agreed that they trusted product of Australia labelling. Now, it's really important to identify the difference between community and consumer here. So we're talking about the community, and this is the thoughts and feelings and values of the community as a whole. That doesn't always translate to the consumer who is purchasing the product. So whilst this is really good news that everyone prefers Australian made, and that's where their value sets sit, it might not translate to a purchase because there's other things that factor into their decision-making process there, including price, shelf position, availability, the list goes on, whether or not the kids are in the shopping trolley screaming bloody murder. So it's important to remember that these are 2 distinct things. Next, there are some key demographic differences. So great question earlier. We can split our data by these key demographics and actually have a look and see what's going on there. There is a focus from the community on environment, sustainability, and animal welfare matters. And when we're thinking about our plant industries specifically, that is about sustainable farming practices, that is about low carbon products, and it's about thinking about which products are low carbon and better or more sustainable for the environment. And the community is really having that discourse with themselves. So they're willing to have the conversation with rural industries as well. Let's just pause for a second to see if there's any other questions. Oh, Jeff, I just like your comment. Women are fabulous, aren't they? All right. So what I'm going to do is just change screens over to our, I'll just have to put the password in first. Okay, so I'm just loading up our data dashboard now. And what we'll do is go for a bit of a run through of what's in here, including things that you can do and the comments that you can see within this dashboard. Now, the LEI team has access to the login and password for this particular dashboard. And if you wanted to understand what data is in here, you can reach out to them. We'll also be providing dashboard training in the coming year. So you'll be able to work with Voconiq on using this dashboard for your own industry's purposes. We also have a learning management system. So if anyone wanted to jump into the dashboard at any time, they contact the LEI team, we can actually put you through some online learning courses that will allow you to understand what's going on at a basic level too. So there's lots of options here for this dashboard. So what we see when we open the dashboard, our homepage has our trust and acceptance core scores. As I said, this is scored on a scale of 1 to 5. So you can see the responses in different colors at the bottom. I can hover over them and actually interrogate what's going on a little bit more. I can see the sample size. So the N is 1227 for this particular one, and it gives me a little bit of detail. down here, we've also got something that will come to light a little bit more as we move on with this study. So we'll have the longitudinal measures. So in the future, you'll actually have 2 dots here, and it will show you what your 2024 score was, and then what your 2025 score was, and then what your 2026 score was. So you can look at these measures longitudinally. If you are somebody that wants to save these images for whatever reason, you can do this on any particular image on this dashboard. You just hover over the top here, you can see my cursor, and you just download the plot as an SVG. So you can put that in a PowerPoint. The next thing I'll just show you quickly is the ability to change the size of this depending on what size screen you've got. So I've currently got this on a laptop screen. I normally find 80% is a really good way to view this, but you might be on a massive screen for some reason, so you can just use that zoom function to change it if it's looking a bit silly. Next, our trust and acceptance in context. So remember how we asked about trust in each particular industry? Well, we're actually able to see where those different industries fared on this little scale here. So you can see everything from, we actually asked about coals. So coals is sitting towards the lower end at 2.4. And you can see here, honeybees is our most trusted industry of this group at 3.61. And as somebody said yesterday, everybody loves bees, so it's not surprising. Okay, so the next thing that is important for you to know in this particular dashboard is that on the Model Insights page, you're able to pull up your Levied Industries Trust Model, which is the thing I talked you through earlier. You've got some drop downs here, not super important at this stage. AgriFutures has the ability to view the CTRI work on this dashboard as well, which is why this top drop down is there. And then you've also got the ability to pull up different models. So next year, once we've conducted our second survey, you'll be able to see your 2025 trust model by using this drop down. So the feature that's most useful in this particular path model is the ability to actually see what is factoring into each of these questions. So the first one here, procedural fairness, if I click on it, you can see down here, it pulls up the questions that factored into that particular driver of trust. And these drivers are our levers to control whether or not we can improve trust or acceptance. So you can see here, I've clicked on this and it's those 2 questions I showed you earlier in the PowerPoint. So whether or not you're prepared to change and whether or not you're listening and respecting. The same thing again, you can hover over these and you can download them as dynamic cards if you desire. Next, what we can do is click on this single survey button on the left-hand side, and we can actually have a look at all of our different question block themes. So we've had a 15-minute survey that's gone out to the Australian community, and we've themed all of the questions into different groups, and you can find them here. Some of them will be blank. For example, the focus questions, we'll be doing focus questions for Levied groups this year, and that will then populate once we've finished that particular survey. Let's have a quick look. The first one is our participant summary. And the only reason I'm showing you this is to help with the question about demographic variables. So you can see here, we actually did an additional level of cleaning. So we ended up using 2,867 responses in this dashboard. If you scroll down, you can see every single demographic feature asked in this particular survey. And again, we've got that longitudinal function. So you'll actually be able to map whether or not this 97% significantly changes over the years for meat or seafood, if you choose. So you can have a look at all of these at your leisure, but the most important thing is that these demographic features are then able to be used as data splits for any other question on our dashboard. So let's go into, maybe we'll go into knowledge and information. I won't show you all of these themes because I've showed you the specific or the most important ones as per the report and as per our trust model. And I would encourage you to go and read that report. And if you've got any additional questions, reach out to the LEI team and we can certainly discuss what else is going in there. Okay, so in that awareness piece, right? So let's have a look. We've got our first set of questions about whether or not you're aware of specific industries. And then we've got uncertainty about rural industries, information sources, and where people get their information from. Interesting if you're working from a comms perspective in any of these rural or levied industries, because you can actually start to see where people are accessing information, and you can split that by different demographic groups. So if we look here, sources of information about Australian rural industries. So overall, 73.5% of the Australian community, or actually 73%, I rounded up accidentally, said that they're going to the internet. So if we remember that 73%, we can then actually explore by different demographics. So let's say we were looking at men, and let's say we're looking at men who are 55%. Let's see whether or not they're as heavily reliant on the internet. So we've clicked those as filters. We can pick any of them, and then we just hit apply filter and we close that little box. So if we go down to our communication, and actually 74% or 75% actually are saying their information comes from television. And for that particular group, only 61% are accessing the internet. So we can start to see how this data is really a great way of not only understanding how to communicate, but also understanding how these different people are thinking, which is great for us. All of these scales have changed as well. So you'll be able to see whether or not this particular group are uncertain about regulation, are trusting particular industries, are feeling like the sustainability measures are in place. So any of our questions can then be split by the demographics that we're looking at here, which is males aged 55 plus. Little tip, always reset the filters after you've applied them, because sometimes otherwise you'll be looking at men over 55 for the rest of your life. Okay, so let's move on. As I said, all of our questions are in this left-hand side bar here, but what we're going to do is jump to some of the other features. Next year, I'll show you the responses over time and the over time with insight function, but they're not relevant for this year because we only have one set of data. So let's go straight to the group means. So this group means allows us to have a look at any survey question by any demographic. And it also allows us to compare them against one another. So this is already acceptance by gender. So you can see here, men are slightly more accepting than women, but it's not really that significant a difference. So let's go into something a little bit different. Let's see if we can find something relevant to us. So I've just clicked Control F, and you can see this beautiful little search bar coming up. I previously searched bees. Let's have a look at hemp. Okay, so this has showed me all of the questions that feature the word hemp, and it's highlighted them. So let's pick two. So we've gone, I can describe the differences between hemp and medicinal cannabis. And let's go, we should use more environmentally sustainable fibers like hemp. So let's have a look at the answers to these two questions. You can select any question you want. You can select just one if you want, and that's probably a good way to start. I would recommend not selecting more than sort of 3, especially if you're going into demographics that have multiple splits, because otherwise you'll just have a graph that's a little bit unreadable. All right, so we've got those 2 questions here now, and we're exploring them by gender. So you can see the males and females here. If you just toggle this, it will actually directly compare the question next to one another, which I think is a bit more useful. Okay, so if we're comparing males and females, more men think that they know about hemp than women, but that difference isn't really significant. What I'm saying here is that these error bars, these little black lines, are pretty much overlapping. By eye, they definitely are. And you can see the confidence interval does overlap as well. So men and women differ in this question, but not in any significant way. Here, men and women differ, and in a significant way, that difference is a bit larger. So here, men agree slightly less than women that we should use more sustainable fibers. So women think they know less about hemp, but are more welcoming it for their sustainability features. Men think they know more, don't really care as much about the sustainability. That being said, a score of 3.75, a raw mean of 3.75 is still relatively high. So men are generally in agreement with that question. You can explore it by any factor. So you might want to explore by age group, and I'll just include only one question now, so it's a bit easier to see. So as you can see now, we've got 3 graphs. It starts to get a little bit trickier to visualize. So 18 to 34, 35 to 54, 55 plus, our question is we should use more environmentally sustainable fibers like hemp. You can see the 35 to 54 group is slightly more in agreement than any other group, and you can see that peters out at 55 plus. So what you can start to do with this tool is actually break down and explore each of your different demographic variables of interest and see whether or not they're actually making a difference to the answers. What you could then do is go back and find the question in our question banks here and have a look at the percentage split when you find something that's significantly different. Because what I would want to know is whether the difference is in the percentage neutral or the percentage agree or disagree. Because remember, if you've got a burgeoning neutral, that's an area that you can impact directly, which is really useful. I might just throw in the people they know in agriculture industry just to see if there's any difference here. And if you know more than 10 people in agriculture, you're probably less likely to use sustainable fibers like hemp. Super interesting. I would caveat that though, because these error bars are a slight bit bigger and they are overlapping. So it's probably not a significant difference, but worth keeping an eye on. Maybe we need to consider how we market to our own industry from a hemp perspective. Okay, so the next important data piece is this generate table function. So you might have a job where for some reason you're constantly having to create tables like me and you're just on Excel all the time. We're actually able to export this data using this function. So all you need to do is basically select whichever question you're interested in, and it will pull up the percentages. We are waiting on a feature that will allow you to multi-select, so you could put every single piece of data in this spreadsheet if you so desired. It will give you the raw numbers, or if you click this toggle, the percentages. Once you've got all of the information in here that you need, you can then simply just press the download button and it will download as, generally I go Excel because it's more workable, it will download as an Excel into your computer. The other piece that's probably really interesting for you all is the comments section. So there's two functions in this comments section. The first is a summary that provides you a word cloud of all of the information. The second is a comments table. This comments table aggregates everything from our open-ended comments section on our survey, which is really, really helpful. The other thing it does is it allows you to filter by things like location, age, education, and what level of trust they had. So you might actually want to focus on people in Metro that are 18 to 35 that did not complete high school, and you might actually really want to get into their head and understand what it is they're thinking. And most of them have no problems, and one of them likes bananas. So that's a really useful tool if you're specifically looking at targeted groups to try and understand what the voice is in those particular areas. The more filters you put on, the harder it will be to find data because we're then getting really discrete. So I picked a really discrete group there, but it is a good way to dig through. Another important way to think about searching this data is just using this search function. So I could look at, maybe there's someone that said something about fodder. No, unfortunately, maybe tea tree. So let's search tea. Here we go. So I've searched the word tea, and it looks like it's mostly just people complaining. All right, let's go to B because that provided us some good outcomes yesterday. Okay, so you can put a search term in, and any time that this word is featured will come up in this particular comment box here. Sometimes, for example, here it says bean, so it's pulling bean out of B, which makes sense. But it's a really good way to search areas of interest. You might want to think about what people are saying about water, for example. Water access and availability does worry me somewhat, and I just can't understand why governments of all persuasions are allowing minority groups to dictate where and when and how many dams can be built to limit rainwater wastage. So that's, I mean, it's an important comment. It's someone from a regional farming area. It's someone from 55 plus, someone with a high school and certificate. But importantly, they're somebody that answered 3. So if you want to get into the mind of somebody that's in a particular area on your trust score of 1 to 5, or you can change that to acceptance as well, then you can search specific words and search those words in here. And if you've got what you're looking for, or you actually just want to get the whole data set, clear the search bar and just press download and download as an Excel. Then you can have that on your desktop and you can look at it whenever you want if that's the kind of thing you're into. And so that is our dashboard. I might just stop there and see if we have any questions. Yeah, Alexander.
Feel free to just come off mute, Alexander, and ask your question verbally.
All right, if you want to just maybe pop your question in the chat and we'll see if anyone else has any questions or comments. While we're waiting, I will just pitch, AgriFutures team will put out a Mentimeter. I'll answer that one in a second, great question. AgriFutures team will put out a Mentimeter or a survey at the end of this session. I would really encourage participation in that Mentimeter, specifically in the areas of feedback. So you might have been looking through our particular report, which the team has so kindly shared on the chat today. But what we're looking for is feedback on whether or not we've met your needs or whether or not you've got any suggestions about emerging themes this year. Now, we won't be able to include all of the feedback, but it's really good for our researchers to consider what's important for you as an industry so we can ensure that we're covering our bases and communicating in a way that is important and meaningful for you. In terms of how do we access the dashboard, so that's going through the LEI team and having a conversation with them, and then we can put anyone who's relevant or anyone who's able to, they will come through me to do some additional training to make sure that you know what you're doing in there and not feeling overwhelmed. Do we have any other questions? Great. Well, I might stop sharing, Emma, and see if we can hand back over to you.
Not a worry. Thank you, Courtney. Yes, as Courtney's mentioned, we will have a little survey happening now. So I will just share my screen so that you will all be able to see the QR code. And if you have any dramas with that, yell out in either by the chat or just verbally is fine. But I wanted to take the opportunity while we're doing that survey to just mention that it's about the webinar today and how we could potentially improve that going forward, noting that we will be doing some more of these types of sessions, both online and potentially in person. We'll all keep our fingers crossed about that one with you all. So we'd like to, perfect it a little more. So give us your feedback on that. But as Courtney's mentioned, there are some questions in there that are more open questions about the CTRI work going forward and what you would like to see in it. So have a little squeeze at that. And this survey will remain open for a little while, so you can complete it after we jump off the webinar if you're interested in that. So great to see a bit of a spread across some industries. That's good to see. And before we all go, I would like to thank a few people. So Courtney, it's been fabulous. We saw this webinar yesterday for the animal industry, and now today I've learned even more things about the plant side of it. And I'm super interested in some of the results from a comms point of view, because me and my team work in adoption and comms. So it's, what is making people think the way they think, and why are they doing that, and how do we reach them? So great. I'm sure others agree that we'd all be keen to dive into that dashboard. So thanks so much for your insight and expertise in the area. It's been fabulous as always. Thanks to my team in the back end. So Louise and Bonnie have been helping in the back end with all the little things. And Alexander, we did try to unmute you, so I'm very sorry that didn't work for any of us. So thanks to the team, and thanks to you guys as attendees. It's always good to have an engagement even online with our industries, and it's been good to see you getting interested in the data and asking the questions, and we're sure that there's going to be more opportunities to do this across the next couple of years in this project. So let us know what else you'd like, what sort of format you'd like it in, and how often, all of those types of things, and the level of information. But thanks for being online today. We will make the recording available and the report, and also the survey link if you wanted to jump back in and add a little bit more once you've had a chance to look at the report. So on that note, I think we will end today's webinar, and we'll catch you all next time with the next batch of community trust data. Thank you very much.
Thanks,